Heavy boots crushed the frosted earth as a towering, wild-eyed mountain man stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed a calloused finger at the heaviest, most ridiculed woman in the settlement. "By spring," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the valley walls, "you'll birth me 3 sons." Winter had arrived early in the Owyhee Basin of 1883, bringing a biting frost that threatened the isolated Amish settlement of Pine Ridge. In a community where relentless physical labor was the only measure of worth, 24-year-old Hannah Stoltzfus was judged by a different scale. Hannah was massive. Carrying over 300 pounds on her 5'4" frame, she was a walking spectacle. In a society of severe austerity, her size was condemned as a loud sin of gluttony, even though she ate no more than her impoverished family. Yards of unadorned gray wool strained across her broad back, and simply carrying milk pails left her breathless. To the congregation, she was a burdensome spinster. To her harsh, pragmatic father, she was nothing more than a failed investment. The young men of the settlement looked right through her, but none were crueler than Ezekiel Bowman. The bishop's lean, sharp-featured son wielded his righteous authority like a whip to mask a deep, sadistic cruelty. "Moving like a foundered mare today, aren't we, Hannah?" Ezekiel sneered one frigid morning outside the communal trading post. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the frozen mud, her flushed cheeks burning. She gripped a 50-pound sack of flour, her thick arms trembling under the strain. "Excuse me, Ezekiel," she murmured. He stepped directly into her path. "My father says the Lord tests us with burdens," he mocked, as the younger men behind him chuckled. "But Jacob must have sinned mightily to be saddled with a heifer he can't trade away. Who'd marry you? You'd break his bed and eat his winter rations before Christmas." Tears pricked Hannah's eyes, but she bit her lip, swallowing the shame. She knew the cruelest truth of all. Her father believed every word. Suddenly, the mocking laughter of Ezekiel's companions died in their throats. The heavy oak door of the trading post swung open, nearly tearing off its iron hinges. Out stepped a giant. It was Caleb Montgomery. He descended from the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains only once a year, a phantom made of muscle, scars, and rumors. Standing 6'6", Caleb was wrapped in the thick furs of wolves and bears he had killed with his own hands. His beard was a wild, untamed thicket of dark auburn, and his eyes were a piercing, icy blue that seemed to look right through the superficialities of the world. He was 32 years old, completely solitary, and, according to the whispered legends of the valley, a man who had never known the touch of a woman. The saloon girls in the distant cattle towns terrified him more than a cornered grizzly. He believed the touch of a corrupted woman would drain his life force and invite disease. He lived by a strict, savage code of purity and survival. Caleb carried a massive bundle of prime beaver and fox pelts over one shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. He stopped on the porch, his cold gaze sweeping over the terrified Amish boys. He despised the townsfolk. To him, they were fragile, petty creatures who understood nothing of the earth's true brutality. His eyes finally landed on Hannah. Ezekiel, trying to regain his composure and puffing out his chest, smirked. "Mind the road, mountain man. We're just trying to get this obstacle out of the way." Caleb didn't look at Ezekiel. He stepped off the porch, his heavy, snow-packed boots crunching against the ice, and walked directly toward Hannah. She stood paralyzed, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Up close, the mountain man smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and raw masculine earth. He was terrifying. Caleb stared at her. He didn't see a burden. In the brutal, unforgiving world of the high peaks, fragility was a death sentence. Skinny women froze. Delicate women perished in childbirth when the snows locked the cabin doors for 6 months. To Caleb's untamed, pragmatic mind, the vast expanses of Hannah's flesh represented warmth, endurance, and profound maternal strength. She was built to survive. She was a fortress. Without a word, Caleb reached out a hand wrapped in scarred leather and grabbed the 50-pound sack of flour from her grip, tossing it onto the porch as if it were a child's toy. Hannah gasped, her hands flying to her chest. "Sir, I must." Caleb turned his imposing frame toward Ezekiel. "You talk too much, little man," Caleb rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly bass that seemed to vibrate in the frozen air. Before Ezekiel could stammer a reply, Caleb turned back to Hannah. He studied her flushed, terrified face, noting the softness of her eyes and the undeniable strength in her wide, heavy frame. A strange, prophetic fire ignited in his icy blue eyes. He had lived in silence for over a decade, waiting for a sign, waiting for a woman strong enough to anchor him to the mountain and bear his legacy before the wilderness swallowed him whole. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at her chest. The entire courtyard went dead silent. "By spring," Caleb bellowed, his voice echoing fiercely off the valley walls, "you'll birth me 3 sons." Hannah's knees nearly buckled under her immense weight. The absolute certainty in his voice was madness. 3 sons? By spring? She had never even been kissed, let alone entertained the idea of a man's touch. "You're mad," Ezekiel shouted, finally finding his voice, though he took a cautious step back. "She's an Amish woman, a daughter of the church, and look at her, she's a sow." Quicker than a striking viper, Caleb's hand shot out. He grabbed Ezekiel by the throat of his woolen coat and lifted the wiry man entirely off the ground. Ezekiel's boots kicked helplessly in the air. "She is a queen of the high timber," Caleb snarled, his face inches from Ezekiel's pale, terrified face. "She has the flesh to survive the freeze and the hips to bear a dynasty. You speak of her with disrespect again, and I'll feed your tongue to my sled dogs." Caleb dropped Ezekiel into the mud. He then marched past the stunned onlookers, heading straight for the small clapboard house of the bishop where Jacob Stoltzfus was known to be meeting. He was going to buy himself a bride. The interior of the bishop's parlor was suffocatingly warm, smelling of beeswax and stale pipe tobacco. When Caleb Montgomery kicked the door open, the elder men, including Jacob Stoltzfus, leapt to their feet in alarm. "I have come for the large woman," Caleb announced, throwing a heavy leather pouch onto the wooden table. It hit the timber with a heavy metallic thud that made the teacups rattle. Jacob Stoltzfus, a man whose face was deeply lined with years of bitter disappointment, stared at the wild man. "You speak of Hannah? My daughter?" "I speak of my wife," Caleb corrected, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I need a woman for the mountain. The winter is coming hard. A thin woman will snap like a dry twig in the January gales. I need one with meat on her bones. She will keep the cabin warm. She will give me sons." Jacob looked at the leather pouch. He slowly reached out and untied the rawhide string. Inside, gleaming in the dull afternoon light, was raw gold dust, more wealth than the entire Pine Ridge settlement saw in 5 years. Caleb had panned it from the secret freezing streams of Devil's Tooth. Jacob's strict religious morals warred violently with his greed and his desperate desire to be rid of his daughter. The elders murmured in shocked whispers. To sell a daughter to an outsider, a savage, was grounds for excommunication. But Jacob was a proud, flawed man. He looked at the gold, then looked at Caleb. "She eats for 3 men, Jacob said coldly, justifying the betrayal to his own conscience. "She is clumsy. She is a burden to the Lord. If you take her, she is dead to this community. She can never return." "She will never want to," Caleb replied. Within the hour, Hannah was standing at the edge of the settlement, trembling beneath a heavy wool blanket. She had no belongings save for an extra dress and a Bible her late mother had given her. The rapid turn of events had left her in a state of paralyzing shock. Her own father had not even hugged her goodbye. He had simply pointed to the mountain man and told her to walk. Caleb stood next to a large wooden sled pulled by 4 massive wolf-like dogs. He looked down at his new bride. Despite her fear, Hannah couldn't help but feel a strange, disorienting spark of awe. For the first time in her 24 years of life, a man was looking at her body not with disgust, but with a fierce, possessive reverence. "Climb on the sled," Caleb instructed gruffly. I cannot," Hannah whispered, her cheeks burning. "I am too heavy. I will break the runners, and the dogs will not be able to pull my weight." Caleb frowned, a look of genuine confusion crossing his weathered face. "The dogs pull 1,000 pounds of moose meat up the slopes. You are a woman, not a glacier. Get on." Reluctantly, awkwardly, Hannah lowered her massive frame onto the wooden sled. It creaked loudly, but it held. Caleb wrapped heavy bear skins around her shoulders, his large hands brushing against her thick neck. A jolt of electricity shot through Hannah's nervous system. His touch was incredibly gentle, completely contrasting his brutal exterior. Being a virgin, Caleb treated her not as a casual conquest, but as a sacred, terrifying vessel of life. "Hold fast," he commanded, moving to the front to lead the dogs. "The ascent is steep." The journey up the Devil's Tooth was a grueling, terrifying ordeal. As they left the safety of the valley, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled like a wounded beast, whipping snow into their faces. Hannah held on for dear life as the sled bumped and jolted over hidden rocks and deep snowdrifts. Hours bled into a white, freezing blur. Halfway up the mountain, the incline became too steep for the dogs to pull the sled with her on it. "You must walk," Caleb shouted over the roar of the wind. Hannah forced herself off the sled. The snow was up to her knees. Every step was an agonizing battle against gravity and her own immense bulk. Her lungs burned as if she were breathing in broken glass. Sweat poured down her face despite the freezing cold, freezing into tiny icicles on her eyebrows. I can't," she gasped after 20 minutes, collapsing into a snowbank. Her heart hammered a frantic, dangerous rhythm. "Leave me. I will die here." Caleb stopped the dogs. He walked back to her, his massive frame blocking the brutal wind. He didn't yell. He didn't insult her like Ezekiel would have. Instead, he dropped to his knees in the snow directly in front of her. "You will not die," Caleb said, his voice a low, intense rumble that pierced through the howling storm. "Look at you. You are a fortress. The wind breaks against you. Your blood is hot. I chose you because you are strong enough to carry the mountain's weight." He reached out and placed his bare, calloused hand against her thick, soft cheek. The warmth of his skin was a lifeline. "I have lived alone for 12 years, Hannah. I made a promise to the mountain that I would only bring a queen to its peak. A woman of substance. Stand up." Tears streamed down Hannah's face, freezing on her cheeks. Nobody had ever called her strong. They had only called her fat. They had only called her a burden, drawing on a reservoir of willpower she never knew she possessed. Hannah planted her heavy boots into the snow and pushed herself up. Caleb nodded approvingly. He took her hand, her wide, thick fingers swallowed completely by his massive grip, and physically pulled her forward. But as they continued their arduous trek into the high timber, they were unaware of the dark shadow creeping up the trail behind them. Back in the valley, Ezekiel Bowman had slipped into the bishop's house shortly after Jacob Stoltzfus had left. He had seen the gold. The sight of such raw, untamed wealth had completely shattered Ezekiel's thin veneer of religious piety. Driven by a venomous mixture of greed and a bruised ego from being humiliated by the mountain man, Ezekiel had stolen the pouch of gold dust. But it wasn't enough. If Caleb had that much gold simply lying in a pouch, there had to be a fortune hidden in his cabin. Ezekiel had recruited 2 desperate, unsavory drifters from the edge of the settlement. Armed with rifles and hunting knives, the 3 men were now tracking the heavy, unmistakable grooves of Caleb's sled through the rising blizzard. Ezekiel's eyes were narrowed with malicious intent. He intended to take the mountain man's gold, kill him, and drag the fat, worthless Hannah back to the settlement in chains, just to prove that Ezekiel Bowman was not a man to be crossed. The storm worsened, burying the mountain in a suffocating blanket of white, setting the stage for a brutal collision between the savage purity of the mountain and the corrupt greed of the valley below. Howling winds battered the sturdy log walls of Caleb's cabin as they finally breached the tree line. The structure was an absolute fortress, built from massive, unpeeled pine trunks and sealed tight against the brutal elements. It was a home designed for a giant, and as Caleb kicked the heavy oak door open, dragging Hannah inside out of the blizzard, the sheer scale of the place made her feel remarkably secure. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, but Caleb moved with practiced, explosive efficiency. He struck a match, and within minutes, a roaring fire devoured the dry birch logs in the massive stone hearth. Golden light flickered across the cabin, revealing thick bearskin rugs, cured meats hanging from the rafters, and shelves lined with jarred preserves. Hannah stood shivering in the center of the room, snow melting into icy puddles around her heavy boots. Her soaked woolen dress clung to her massive frame, chilling her to the bone. She wrapped her thick arms around herself, violently trembling, her gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards. The shame that had been violently drilled into her by the Pine Ridge congregation threatened to swallow her whole. She was alone in a cabin with a savage mountain man, completely isolated from everything she had ever known, and she felt impossibly huge, grotesque, and exposed. "Take off the wet wool," Caleb commanded, his deep voice slicing through the crackle of the fire. He didn't look at her as he spoke, busying himself with boiling snow in an iron kettle. "You will freeze from the inside out if you keep that ice against your skin." I cannot," Hannah stammered, her voice thick with panic and deeply ingrained modesty. "It is not proper, and I am awful to look upon." Caleb stopped. He set the iron kettle down and turned to fully face her. The firelight caught the wild, untamed auburn of his beard and the piercing, icy blue of his eyes. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet cabin. He stopped just inches away, his towering frame dwarfing even her considerable width. "Awful?" Caleb repeated, the word tasting foul in his mouth. "Who told you that? The little men in the valley? The ones who break their backs trying to pull a plow through frozen dirt?" He reached out, his large, scarred hands gently grasping her thick, shivering shoulders. His touch sent a profound, terrifying heat straight into her chest. "You are not awful," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent rumble. "You are magnificent. I have seen the skinny women in the cattle towns, trembling in the wind, their bones sharp enough to cut a man. They are fragile, they carry sickness. But you—" His hands traced the wide, soft curve of her shoulders, moving down to the thick expanse of her arms. "You carry life. You carry warmth. In the high timber, flesh is a gift from God. It means survival." With a trembling breath, Hannah allowed him to help her unfasten the heavy buttons of her soaked dress. As the gray wool fell to the floor, she stood in her simple white cotton shift, the fabric strained against the vast, rolling curves of her stomach, her wide hips, and her heavy maternal breasts. She closed her eyes tightly, bracing for the disgust she was certain would come. Instead, she felt his lips press gently against the soft, thick flesh of her neck. Hannah gasped, her eyes flying open. Caleb was looking at her body with absolute, unfiltered worship. He was a man who worshipped the earth, the mountains, and the primal forces of nature, and in Hannah he saw the ultimate embodiment of all three. He was a virgin, completely untouched by the corruptions of the brothels, and his approach to her was incredibly gentle, yet fiercely possessive. He lifted her a feat of impossible strength that left Hannah completely breathless, and carried her 300 pounds to the massive timber bed, covered in deep, luxurious furs. "I made a vow," Caleb whispered fiercely, hovering over her, his immense heat radiating against her chilled skin. "I promised the mountain a queen, a woman strong enough to anchor me, strong enough to birth my legacy without breaking." That night, amidst the howling fury of the blizzard, the virgin mountain man and the outcast Amish woman forged a bond written in fire and survival. He worshipped every inch of her massive frame, treating her perceived flaws as sacred treasures. For the first time in her life, Hannah's body was not a burden. It was a sanctuary. It was the very reason she was cherished. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Caleb rested his head against the vast, soft expanse of her chest, listening to the powerful, steady beating of her heart. By spring, he murmured into the darkness, his voice thick with emotion, 3 sons. But the darkness outside was not entirely empty. A mile down the trail, struggling violently against the waist-deep snow, Ezekiel Bowman and his 2 hired drifters, Jeb and Rufus, were closing in. Their faces were wrapped in frozen scarves, their eyes alight with greedy, murderous intent. They had followed the dog tracks just before the wind had completely wiped them away. Ezekiel clutched the stolen pouch of gold to his chest, his mind poisoned by visions of the mountain man's hidden fortune. "There!" Jeb shouted over the wind, pointing a frost-bitten finger toward the faint glow of the cabin's chimney through the dense pine trees. Ezekiel sneered, pulling his heavy Winchester rifle from his shoulder. "Remember," he shouted to the men, "shoot the savage on sight. The fat sow is mine to discipline. I'll make her drag his corpse all the way back to the valley." The heavy oak door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the heavy iron bolt shattering the timber frame. Caleb was instantly awake. Years of surviving grizzly attacks and hostile elements had hardwired his reflexes. He threw himself out of the fur-lined bed just as a rifle shot tore through the darkness, burying itself deep into the log wall exactly where his head had been a second prior. "Get down!" Caleb roared at Hannah, kicking a heavy iron trunk in front of the bed to shield her massive form. Ezekiel, Jeb, and Rufus stormed into the cabin, bringing the screaming blizzard with them. The wind whipped the dying embers of the fire into a chaotic frenzy of sparks. Caleb dove for his hunting knife resting on the wooden table, but Rufus fired his revolver. The bullet grazed Caleb's shoulder, tearing through flesh and muscle. The giant mountain man grunted, spinning around, but he didn't fall. With a terrifying primal roar, Caleb hurled the heavy oak chair he was crouching behind directly at Rufus, crushing the man against the doorframe and knocking him unconscious. Ezekiel panicked. He leveled his Winchester at Caleb's chest, his hands shaking violently. "Stay down, you savage! Where is the gold? Where is the rest of it?" "Ezekiel!" Hannah screamed. Jeb, a filthy, missing-tooth drifter, lunged toward the bed, his eyes locked on the terrified woman. "Well, well," Jeb cackled, dropping his gun to draw a long hunting knife. "Ain't you a mountain of meat? Bishop's boy said you was big, but I reckon there's enough of you to keep a man warm all winter." Jeb reached out, grabbing Hannah by the collar of her shift. It was a fatal mistake. For 24 years, Hannah had been told she was weak, clumsy, and useless. But the night with Caleb had ignited a dormant, blazing fire within her soul. She was not a burden. She was a fortress. And this filthy intruder was threatening the only man who had ever loved her. Adrenaline surged through her massive frame. Hannah didn't scream. Instead, she reached out with hands that had spent a lifetime lifting 50-pound sacks of flour and churning heavy vats of butter. She grabbed Jeb by his wrists. The drifter's eyes widened in sudden, absolute terror as he realized his grip was entirely useless against her sheer strength. With a fierce, guttural cry, Hannah used her 300 pounds of weight, twisting her body and hurling herself forward. She slammed her massive shoulder directly into Jeb's chest. The impact was like a runaway freight train. Jeb was thrown backward through the air, crashing violently into the heavy cast-iron stove. He hit the unyielding metal with a sickening crunch and slumped to the floor, instantly dead from a broken neck. Ezekiel stared in sheer horror at the sight of the giant, furious woman standing amidst the wreckage. In his moment of distraction, Caleb lunged. The mountain man ignored the bleeding wound in his shoulder, tackling Ezekiel to the floor. The rifle clattered away. Caleb's massive hands wrapped around Ezekiel's throat, lifting the wiry, treacherous man off the floorboards. "You brought your valley rot to my mountain," Caleb growled, his icy eyes blazing with lethal fury. "Wait! Mercy!" Ezekiel choked out, his face turning a deep, violent shade of purple. "I am a man of God." "You are a thief," Caleb spat. He didn't kill him. Instead, Caleb dragged Ezekiel to the open doorway and hurled him out into the raging blizzard. "Crawl back to your valley, little man. If the wolves don't eat you, the frost will. You are banished from this peak." Caleb slammed the shattered door shut, shoving a massive timber beam across it to secure it against the storm. He turned, breathing heavily, blood seeping down his arm. Hannah rushed to him, her heavy footsteps shaking the floorboards. She tore a strip of clean linen from her shift and began to bind his wound, her thick fingers surprisingly deft and gentle. Caleb looked down at her, a fierce, proud smile breaking through his wild beard. "You saved my life, my queen." Hannah looked up, tears of relief welling in her eyes. "You gave me the strength to do it." The brutal winter raged outside for months, but inside the cabin, the fires of survival and profound love kept the darkness at bay. Hannah's immense size, as Caleb had predicted, proved to be an unparalleled blessing. She didn't suffer the deep, bone-chilling freezes that claimed the lives of the frailer women in the valley below. She thrived. Her body was built for the rugged, demanding life of the high timber, and under Caleb's adoring, constant affection, she blossomed. When April finally arrived, the deep snows began to melt, sending rushing waterfalls down the jagged face of Devil's Tooth. The mountain was waking up. A rugged, elderly midwife from the neighboring Shoshone settlement had been summoned by Caleb a week prior, brought up the mountain on a specialized sled. Now, she stood in the doorway of the cabin, wiping her hands on a linen towel, a look of absolute astonishment on her weathered face. Caleb paced the porch, his massive boots wearing grooves into the damp wood. When he saw the midwife, his heart stopped. "My wife?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling for the first time in his life. "She is a marvel," the midwife laughed, shaking her head. "I have delivered hundreds of babies, mountain man, but never have I seen a woman bear it with such immense strength. Her hips were made for this. She didn't even tear." "The child?" Caleb pressed, stepping toward the door. "Child." The midwife chuckled, stepping aside to let him pass. "You'd better go look for yourself." Caleb rushed into the cabin. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the golden dust motes in the air. Hannah lay exhausted but glowing on the heavy furs of their bed. She looked more beautiful than ever, her wide face flushed with profound, maternal triumph. Nestled against her vast, soft chest, wrapped tightly in white wool, were 3 tiny, squirming bundles. Caleb fell to his knees beside the bed. He reached out with a trembling, calloused finger, lightly touching the incredibly soft cheek of the first infant, then the second, then the third. They all had fine tufts of reddish hair. 3 sons, Hannah whispered, tears of pure joy spilling down her cheeks. She looked at the giant, wild man who had claimed her when the world had discarded her. "Just as you declared." Caleb leaned forward, burying his face in her heavy, warm neck, weeping openly. The outcast Amish woman, ridiculed for her weight and discarded by her family, had not only survived the deadliest winter on record, she had conquered the mountain. She was the fortress that protected their love, the fire that kept them alive, and the mother of a dynasty that would rule the high timber for generations to come. If you were captivated by this incredible tale of wild romance, mountain justice, and the true meaning of strength, be sure to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love historical drama and unexpected twists. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired storytelling from the untamed frontiers of history.